You are listening to a podcast from The Hindu.
I am Jacob Koshi.
And I'm Shobna Nair, and this is the
Rearview. Here we dive into the history of things, events, discoveries, and inventions.
I am woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore, and I know too much to go back and pretend.
I can never forget the way he treated me just because I was a woman. This was a great insult to me. The bias against women was so bad at that time. What can one expect if even a Nobel laureate behaves in such a way? Jacob, that was scientist Kamala Sohoni talking about C.V. Raman, India's first,
Foremost
first and foremost scientist.
and the only winner of a Nobel Prize in the sciences so far.
You can bend but never break me, cause it only serves to make me more determined to achieve my final goal.
So, Shobna, in the 17 odd episodes we've done so far, we've generally tended to focus on a single person or, a single phenomenon. But for this episode, we have not one, not two, but three stellar scientists. And the common thread connecting all of them is that they're all women. Now, what's interesting about them, and one of them is Kamala Sohoni, whose very evocative quote you read out. So they were all Indian scientists who were the first ones to be trained in our scientific institutions. Their careers corresponded with India achieving its independence, and through their stories, we're going to take a look at what kind of challenges they faced, what kind of whether their sexism was an everyday aspect of being a scientist in India. It very much still is. I mean, there are challenges even today, but are today's problems different from what was there previously? So, Shobna, who are the three people specifically we are talking about today?
So we are going to talk about Kamala Soni, whose remark I read out in the beginning of this episode, Janaki Ammal, and Annaman. I mean, my reading of that book was, I was just taken by the fact that she is born in Tellicherry in Kerala, and she travels. She for studies. She travels to USA, and then during the Second World War, she spends a significant amount of time in London. So
And it was about plants. I mean, she was a botanist, and I believe right from her early childhood, she had a very close association and fascination with plants, and she chose to major most of her career into them. Right?
She's the scientist responsible for putting sweetness in our sugarcane varieties. So before her, we had to import because our sugarcane was not good enough to be used, to be converted into uh, by the sugar industry. And Janaki Ammal was born in 1897, Telacheri, Kerala, in a middle class family. Her father, Diwan Bahadur Krishnan, was a sub judge in the Madras presidency, and her mother, Devi, came from a lineage that valued education. And we shall see as we proceed through this episode that this is one common thread between all the three women, that their families uh,
Prioritize women's education
women's
particularly.
education, while her sisters and were more interested in getting married and everything. But Janaki, as I just said, that opted for scholarship, and and she left the shores pretty early on, and she was a traveler. Her
Yeah.
So she begins her schooling from Sacred Heart Convent in Talasheri, and goes on to earn a bachelor's degree from Queen's Mary College and an honors degree in botany from the Presidency College in Madras. And after a very brief stint at teaching, which she hated, by the way.
This was at the Madras Christian College.
Yes, at a Madras Christian College, because what she loved the best was to wander around, look at the plants, collect specimens. She was a
But
science.
this was a common progression. I mean, you once you have a sciences degree,
Yeah,
to be anywhere connected to university, you are a teacher
yeah,
basically.
because also we have to remember the context that we are talking about. This is 1900 and 1921. It is India as a form also is sort of barely existing. We have a, a huge portion of the subcontinent under the British rule, and a significant portion under various feudal control. So after her brief stint, she goes to University of Michigan for her master's degree in 1925, and she comes back to India to work as a genetist in Sugarcane Breeding Institute, Coimbatore. And as a single woman from a marginalized caste, she was often at odds with her male peers.
So she worked extensively on genetic crosses, and she studied the chromosomes of thousands of different kinds of flowering plants and compiled them on all in this book called the Chromosome Atlas of Cultivated Plants, which she co-authored with the biologist C.D. Darlington. Even today, there are, I mean, not sugarcane, but there are different kinds of plants which actually bear her name. There is an entire herbarium in Jammu Kashmir by one of the CSR institutes, which is called the Janaki Ammal herbarium.
Yeah. And in fact, she also has an magnolia variety named after
That's
her.
the plant I was looking for.
Yes, called Magnolia Kubus Janaki Ammal. Now, it is interesting that you talk about the atlas that she co authored with Cyril Darlington. I need to talk to you about the context in which this atlas was written. She had arrived in England in 1940, just as the Second World War was
That's
warming up.
interesting. Why did she go away from India to England in the middle of a world war?
I think for her, her scientific pursuits were far greater interest than anything. She also was invited by the Royal Horticulture Society. So imagine if a war is happening, but you do get a interesting invitation. I'm sure Jacob, you will also go. So
That depends. If it's a war and sensibilities are different, as we will see, the other scientists that we will talk about, that is Annamani and
Kamala
Kamala Sohoni,
Sone.
they were very in thrall of the nationalist movement that time. So it looks like Janaki Ammal was more of the purist like
uh,
scientists
well,
less nationalistically inclined,
I
if
don't
I may
want to
so? Did
pass
Preeta
any,
Nayar's book shed
yeah,
any
I
light
don't
on
want to
this?
pass any judgment on that, but she will, as we will talk ahead about her life, we'll come to that. But just on this particular point, that when she arrived in London, the World War was raging. So there was of course bombings happening, and London famously was bombed beyond recognition.
Churchill era.
Yeah, Churchill era. And so every time the bombings happened, she would dive under her bed, and then, once the bombs are the strafing is over, she would come out and continue with her
Imagine last week
research.
we were both wondering if we also would have to dive under our beds, right?
Yes,
But we
I
didn't. It
know.
didn't come to that, I
And
guess.
I know, and we also heard siren. I believe you
Absolutely.
were in
I
office
Yeah.
when the sirens played out.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
that was there, and yet she was able to stick her. I mean, focus her attention on
And now,
botany.
yeah, now you may want to answer your nationalism question, because she does come back, Jacob. She does come back. And who does she come back for? She comes back on the invitation of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru
Wow.
to reorganize the Botanical Survey of India in Calcutta. And she became the first woman to head a central government science institution.
And I believe she traveled to several other of these institutes. Both as a scientist as well as an administrator, playing roles in restructuring it. And eventually, she was awarded the Padma Shri in 1977. And in 2000, the Ministry of Environment and Forests created a National Award of Taxonomy in her name.
And she was also a very passionate activist, environmental
Yes,
activist, and her role in Silent Valley movement cannot be ignored.
I guess, yeah, just like Salim Ali, whom we had
Yes,
discussed, a few
just a
months back.
couple of
Yeah,
episodes back.
we have this. So in my mind, I have this picture of a very, she would like how, I don't know how there are nerdy scientists. So did she project the impression as of somebody who was nerdy and was only somebody who with her head in the plants looking for new varieties of
Yeah,
magnolia,
or
etc.? How did she
with
look?
plants
And
growing on her
possibly,
head
yeah,
or something.
I
No,
know she.
I will read out a very sweet passage from her obituary that was published in the Hindu, where her niece Geeta Doctor says this about her, and I quote: Janaki was a tall and commanding presence in her prime. She tied her lustrous hair into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. In later years, she took to wearing brilliant yellow silk saris with long, loose blouse or jacket in the same color. Her status presence reminded people of a Buddhist lady monk. Like certain Buddhist orders, she took a vow of chastity, austerity, and silence for herself, limiting her needs to the bare minimum. She refused to speak about her life, saying, My work is what will survive. I wonder how many remember that work in India, Geeta Doctor
So yeah, so she comes
said.
upon as this very Yoda like monkish kind of figure, and that is somebody that is a kind of persona which is very much identified even with Anna Mani, the meteorologist.
The second scientist that we are profiling today.
Yes, and she too was known for wearing these homespun khadi saris, and apparently very much inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, and as a child when he came to Kerala from where she was. But again, she was somebody who uh, was also Malayali, just like Janaki Ammal. She grew up in a prosperous family in Travancore, Kerala, and she was the seventh of eight siblings. And very much like Amal, it seems to me that she also came from a family that, as we mentioned, prioritized education. Her father was a civil engineer with large cardamom estates, so they look fairly well off. They belonged to a Syrian Christian community, though her father was an agnostic all his life. And it was very typical upper class professional household where children were where the male boys were kind of groomed for high level careers, but and the daughters are prime for marriage. But Annamani seemed to have a independent streak very early on. He was a voracious reader, and
Yeah, and since we spoke about austerity, there is this very off-quoted incident about in Anamani's life. So apparently, there was a tradition in the family that when a girl on a girl's eighth birthday, she's
set of
given
diamond ring.
diamond earrings, basically jewelry, some bit of jewelry, and on her eighth birthday, she was offered diamond earrings. And she said, "Thank you very much. I don't need these diamond earrings. Please keep it for yourself. I would rather have Encyclopedia Britannica, the
Wow,
entire set."
that's so independent minded and so nerdy at the same time, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So apparently, she really loved these books and she devoured nearly all of her books. But in 1925, there was the famous Vaikam Satyagraha where Gandhi came to Kerala. And this had a kind of made a big impression of her. The whole motto of the Satyagraha was one caste, one religion, and one God. And it kind of, I believe, evoked some kind of idealistic fire within her. And she felt very inclined towards nationalistic politics, etc. But as far as I know, she did not explicitly join any political party. But I believe that's when she took on wearing khadi clothes, khadi. And I guess this would have been very different from the lustrous yellow saris of Amal.
Amal, yeah.
But I mean, this is something she maintained all through her life, and she this independent streak continued. I mean, she didn't want to get married like her sisters, and
And that's
she
the other common thing between Amal and
absolutely.
Mani, because both of them chose not to marry
Yes.
and dedicate themselves to their studies.
And it turned out that her family seemed to be neutral to it. I mean, there was neither active opposition or encouragement. So she's somebody who does not really depend on social sanctions or approval to do what she wanted.
She's a very interesting character, Jacob, as we have been discussing her. I mean, since last evening, while preparing for this recording, we have been discussing Anamani a lot. But before we come to those problematic or the controversial bits of her life, let me also give you taster of who Kamala Soni was, because she turns out is very essential for Anamani's own entry into science in many ways. Kamala was born in a family of renowned chemists. Her father, her brother, her uncle, everybody was.
So that's different from the other two women, right? I mean,
Yeah. So she just, you know, when you're growing up with science all around you, you just assume that, this is the
and
path.
specifically chemistry, they're all
Yeah,
chemists.
they
So
are
she
all
thought, I'm going
chemists.
to be a
Yeah,
chemist
so,
too.
the path is laid out, and she thought that all that she has to do was take a stroll. That was not the case, however. So, after passing her BSc from the Bombay University, where she stood first in the exam, I she applied for research
And
work.
just quickly note, unlike our other two protagonists, she was not Malayali, but she was from Indore in
Yes,
Madhya
please.
Pradesh.
Yes, I have. Lest we are accused of only profiling Malayalis, she had no connection to Kerala whatsoever. Or did she? I don't know. Anyhow, so she, after completing her BSc from Bombay University, where she stood first, she thought about doing research work at the famous Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore,
Where C.V. Raman was the director.
was the dawn. Okay, she applied and received a prompt refusal. CV Raman refused to accept women just on the dint of her gender. I mean, he didn't go even beyond that. Just because she was a woman, she was told, "I'm sorry, you won't be allowed to enter." Now, here we have another influence of Gandhi, because Kamala Sohni then does a satyagraha in front of Raman's office,
And that was
ref-
Gandhi's innovation at that time,
absolutely
Satyagraha.
refusing to budge till Raman relented. And Raman had to relent. But Raman, being Raman, also laid down conditions. Uh, One of them was that she will be on probation for an entire year. And what does probation mean? That all her work will be scrutinized, and it has to have approval, prior approval. And it was after a year of scrutiny that she was finally allowed in formally. And he was, in fact, so impressed by Sohni's dedication and perseverance that he started admitting lady students into his
So she was
lab.
a trailblazer in terms
Absolute
of the
trailblazer.
IIC, which is India's foremost scientific and research institution, to have, to admit women scientists who are now, dime a dozen, through the years over there.
And the interesting thing is that she worked on uh, something that helps us on a daily basis, because she worked on nutrition. So she worked on proteins. Her initial research was on proteins in milk, pulses, and legumes. And in fact, she was perhaps the first student in IIC to work on pulse proteins. To talk about lentils and the quantum of proteins they have. And she went on to work in Cambridge University, where while working on potatoes, she found that every cell of plant tissue also contains an enzyme called cytochrome C, which is involved in oxidation of the plant cells. Now, this was an original discovery. And what I found breathtaking and amazing was the fact that her PhD thesis, she completed the research and writing in 14 months since arriving at Cambridge. And, Jacob, hold your breath, it consisted only of 40 pages.
Wow.
Yeah, a PhD thesis, only 40 pages. So imagine what
What succinctness and such
yeah,
clarity of
yeah,
mind. And
absolutely. And so, in fact, there is it is believed that she is perhaps the first Indian woman in Cambridge on whom the title of PhD was conferred.
and she was fairly keen on returning to India, and she came back and started work at the Lady Hardinge College in New Delhi in 1939 as professor and head of the newly opened Department of Biochemistry. And later on, she even served as assistant director at the Nutrition Research Laboratory in Kunnur. But she did a lot of work on vitamins. Later on, the government of Maharashtra invited applications for the post of professor of biochemistry. She applied, she was selected. And as you mentioned, a lot of her work was related to improving nutrition or improving the vital qualities of agricultural products. Not very dissimilar to what Janaki
Janaki
Ammal
Ammal
did
was
with
working on.
sugarcane. She, in fact, she's known for her work on the nutritional aspects of Nira, and in fact, this work was started on a suggestion by by the president of that time, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. And she showed that the introduction of Nira, which is a derivative of coconut sap, in the diet of tribal malnourished adolescent children and pregnant women caused significant improvement in their overall health. But throughout her tenures in government labs over here, and she did face instances of sexism. And while it is not explicitly laid out how, it is believed that it affected her, her rise or promotions, in some of these in places. But overall, she lived what would be cliched would be called a full life. She did not. In fact, one of her biographies quite dramatically says that when Dr. Satyavati, who was a chairperson of the ICMR, and in fact the first woman DG of the Indian Council of Medical Research, learned of Kamala Sohoni. So imagine one woman learned of another pioneering scientist many, many years after her own time. She decided to make amends. She invited Kamala, who was then 84, and felicitated her in a ceremony in New Delhi. And at this ceremony, I believe in the midst of a speech, she collapsed and died. And the writer of this particular piece about her says, "What better end could one wish for?" I
I
have my doubts
agree.
about that,
No. I totally agree.
but still,
Yeah, I want to go. If I'm going, I want to
can you
go in a
imagine yourself
blaze. Yeah,
just
absolutely.
just going to
Kneeling,
Parliament, writing out your Parliament copy, and
or
the
maybe,
session ends,
or maybe Jacob kneeling over right now.
and the Parliament goes sign a die. You also want to go die. Good, that's a
Okay.
bit too dramatic, I'm sure. But anyway, it is what it is. That
Yeah.
was quite a
So before we wade into the important part, how gender,
yeah.
what roadblock does gender introduce for a scientist? Let us talk about the context. As I said right in the beginning, in these women, the three women that we are profiling today,
Oh, very quickly. And of the three, it turns out that she actually married, and she
she's
was
the
not
only
the
one
only one of the three
who
who
married. In fact, she marries to Mr. Sawney,
get her, who's
and
also a chemist.
yeah, who go, no, he's not, he's an actuary,
Oh,
he's a
okay.
statistician.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
CA kind of
yeah,
science.
yeah. So let me now set the stage and tell you about the context that these women lived in, and talk about, let's also weigh in on what it meant for a woman scientist. Now, in the 19th century is when we had many social reformers who did a lot to promote women's education, but of course its impact was varied from one region to another. And formal education, first, was the access to formal education was limited for women only in the upper classes and the middle classes in the second half of the 19th century, and that too mostly in Bengal and Bombay. And in fact, in Bengal there was such emphasis on education that it was it was essential requirement if you want to call yourself, what they say, bhadra mahila, bhadra lok, if you
So
wanted
it
an
was an
entry of
indicator of social status.
social status, and even wealth, because only the wealthy could afford to send their women to study. But again, while we decry the various limitations that women had in India, we should applaud when that is the case. University of Calcutta, which was established on 25th January 1857, was producing its first women graduates within 25 years of its establishment. In fact, it started accepting women on its rolls before the University of London. And uh, there needs to be a comparison with Oxford and Cambridge, because women were granted full membership and the right to take degrees in University of Oxford on October 7, 1920. So
Just like when India got free, we did not have did need to have a separate movement for women's voting
voting
rights.
rights, we had
It
universal
just came
suffrage.
came with the
Yeah,
deal.
these are interesting details. And as I said, that there was a, but yet, the attitude towards women's education was very, was actually informed by the societal norms. So in 1913, the British government adopted a resolution that said, and I quote, the education of girls should be practical with reference to the position they will fulfill in social life, and should not seek to imitate education suitable for boys, nor should it be dominated by examinations.
So one aspect about why these university educated women, there seem to be a preference, or there seem to be more opportunities in the newly established medical colleges. In fact, some of the earliest women, you know, who graduated from Calcutta University, as you mentioned, for example, Chandramukhi Bose and Kadambini Ganguly, they were also the earliest women physicians in India. And that was because the British had started establishing medical colleges for primarily white British women, where they could look upon women's problems, particularly, uh, biological problems. So
And
it.
also, Jacob, they because there were strict segregation in Indian society. There were jananas where men weren't allowed entry, and it was essential to have women doctors to access these
So in one
closed.
way, the education, I mean, what was offered was kind of limited to, and under the assumption that women ought to be educated just so that they can cater better to, to other women. And it was from here that you never had there was always this debate about, should all these women who are going to universities, should they be learning physics and chemistry and
Yeah, of
math,
course not.
because it was not it didn't directly relate to
What will they
women's
use it
problems.
for? Yeah, what
And
will.
it is this sentiment that was very strongly present even in our supposed radical and revolutionary, not only the scientists and leaders, but even our political leaders. For example, it is said that Abbasur, the sociologist of science, says that Mahatma Gandhi reflected the dominant view of educated Indians, namely, and I quote, as nature has made men and women different, it is necessary to maintain a difference between the education of the two. True, they are equals in life, but their functions differ. It is woman's right to rule the home. Man is master outside it. Man, and in this case, obviously it's male, is the earner. Woman spends and saves. In this scheme of nature, and it is just as it should be, woman should not have to earn her living. So anything that fosters this particular division was encouraged vis-a-vis and what is interesting is that unlike in the older discourse in Europe or in the British medical circles, there doesn't seem to be any dispute about the fact that women were intellectually inferior. Indian women were intellectually inferior, or for example, there is a whole range of studies where people studied the brains of men and women and sought to argue that women were not equipped for certain higher fields of learning because of biological and anatomical differences. This debate was not really, I mean, I've not seen it really in the Indian context, but it is that because women had a particular played a role in the society, in the social structure, they ought to remain within that social structure.
So this is what brings us to CV Raman's lab. As we said, as I read out right in the beginning, a remark from Kamala Soni. Now, Kamala Soni, as we told you, was the first woman who did a satyagraha in front of Raman's office, and that is how Raman relented. So, in a way, Raman opened the doors for women to, I mean, Kamala Soni opened the doors for women to enter this field, and Anna Mani, who followed her, benefited from this Kamala Soni's agitation.
And Anamani had a similar issue with, at the IIC. She never actually got her PhD
PhD, yeah.
because she was denied on some very specific technical round that she did not have an MSc degree, and therefore she possibly could not be granted a PhD. Even today, apparently, her thesis is there, dust gathering in some archive of the IISc, like many other dissertations. But they chose to overlook the fact that Annamani had graduated with honors in physics and chemistry, and she had won a scholarship for her graduate studies on the basis at ISC on the basis of this particular degree. So, but the interesting thing is Sony did a satyagraha and fought for it. She because she absolutely wanted that equality and she got it. Annamani did not really, bear. She did not seem to have borne any particular grudge towards it. It is just like, I guess, the story how we were discussing about how when she was growing up and how she just decided not to marry,
Okay.
irrespective of her
Yeah,
family. This thing.
before, because most of the audience does not know what we have been debating, let me just read out a remark from Annamani. Okay, she was asked about discrimination against women in sciences, and in an interview to the Bulletin of World Meteorological Organization, she said, "For myself, I must say that at no time did I experience professional discrimination as a woman in what was considered largely a man's world. I did not feel I was either penalized or privileged because of being female." Now that rankled me a bit. Was she gender blind? Did she not see it? Was she insensitive? Or was it a strategic ploy, as Abhasur says, to ensure a place in science by decrying attention to the difference? And I believe that it could be that the second thing, because especially because when as a woman you have your presence is always discounted, and therefore you always want to go travel the extra length to say that please judge me on my work, do not judge me on the basis of my gender. And perhaps some women take on that, it's a defense mechanism that they take on this role of saying that do not talk about the limitations, do not talk about the hurdles that I had to cross. I am here standing right next to you in this race, so please treat me like a, your peer.
But unlike I mean, she's working with clean energy environment. But unlike Janaki Ammal, who would be an environmentalist and who's written letters protesting Silent Valley, Annamani apparently did not think too highly of of environmentalists. She called them carpetbaggers.
Yeah. I want to counter your comment, Jacob, of science being gender neutral. And I will use money's own experience, because, see, even when we are conducting any experiment, we have to always think of the external pressures, or think of about the other factors, external factors that could impact the result, the outcome. Now, in case of money, Abhasur recalls, Abhasur okay, before I talk about this incident, I would highly recommend everyone to read Abasur's book, Dispersed Radiance, because she analyzes the gender and caste angle in the Indian context, in the Indian scientific community. So here she Mani, in her interview to Abhasur, speaks of of Raman, CV Raman's behavior when she was initially, she also studied at IIC, as we mentioned. Now, Raman maintained a strict separation of sexes in his laboratory, and his especially, and this was especially applicable for so all the women students had to work isolated from their peers. And the problem, however, here is that in science, the practice of discussion and debate about the scientific ideas among your peers is as crucial to conducting experiments and going through the usual churn. So by doing this segregation, by isolating these women, you are basically putting them in a periphery of the scientific enterprise, which also in a way imposes another further limitation.
It kind of reminds me of how the West, the early computers. I mean, the computer was actually a person, somebody who would actually be making those tedious calculations. And there was for a long time, especially in the early 20th century, most of the computers were women,
Yeah.
who were assigned with even making calculations for NASA. And as there are so many
What
women
was
books
that
in
great movie that
Hidden Figures.
yes, Hidden Figures. Now there is, again, while Money went out of her way to say that gender did not impose any limitation, gender did not retard her progress. She does recall incidents from her time in Raman's lab. So apparently, Raman was so strict that a male and a female student should not walk together. So he would mutter scandalous, scandalous every time a male and a female student were even having a normal chat. Yeah. And Mani says that Raman must have had an uncanny sense, for even while bending over a microscope, he would be able to catch a glimpse of an offending couple and mutter scandalous,
Doesn't
scandalous.
seem like a fun man to work with in under any circumstances,
You
right? In
know
a
what?
lab.
Raman has figured in so many of our episodes. I think we should, at some
Absolutely.
point,
But Shobra, none of these episodes, these biographies, detail a lot about his treatment of women scientists. But we shall dig and find out. But anyway, she, as you said, she made light of her difficulties and discriminations she encountered as a woman scientist. And interestingly, I mean, she was the director general of meteorology. She also turned entrepreneur. She actually had oversaw an entire industrial unit of men who were making solar radiation instrumentation, and it was she really spanned an entire arc of being scientist, being being a leader of institutions, as well as being an entrepreneur and an industrialist. And that brings that question, which we were discussing earlier, of science being neutral and it just being a disinterested discovery. There has been this entire debate actually on if women did science, or when women did science, would did they do science differently? Would they ask questions? Would they investigate questions which are different from what a man in chemistry or a man in biology or a man in physics would ask? And in fact, this is Londa Shibenga, who's an American scholar. She has examined these gender questions very, very carefully. She has a very interesting book written in 1999 called "Has Feminism Changed Science?" And she cites several examples of how thinking in various scientific fields has shifted. It's because of work led by women biologists that the Federal Drugs Administration in the United States, the regulator, they require that drugs be tested in women as well as men, because for a long time it was like, oh, there's a drug, you know both of them are the same species, so how different can it be? The study of primatology, it changed its focus from the alpha male to the whole of primate life. The famous Lucy fossil, it's a 3.2 million year fossil, technically is a woman, and it should have been called Linus. She hold there is an interesting example she mentions of how the Volvo, which was designed by a team of women, pointing out that the seat belts actually ought to be adjusting for pregnant bellies, because that's not something that men would be designing the seats to think of. So it is now very well established that even the way we think about biology, the way we think about how genetic evolution, reproduction, there is an entire field. I mean, people might call it feminist biology, but they come up with entirely new ways of asking certain questions. The questions of contraception itself. Why is that contraception has always been about, has been directed
at women.
at
Why is it a
women?
burden of women
Yeah,
alone?
and you've never really thought about
Male pills.
male pills. So all of this,
Yeah,
so there is a
or even as basic thing as menopause, which impacts half the population, and there's not enough research on the impact of menopause on a woman's bodies.
but again, when we come back to the Indian context, you actually see that even in the examples that we discussed or we talk about, we also ended up in one way talking about the exceptionalism of these women. I mean, we saw that, oh, two out of three were single. We highlighted the facts that they led these protests.
and they broke
They
barriers, they
had to,
traveled
yeah.
when traveling was even the men weren't doing as much traveling, as we saw Amal going from Madras to US to in the middle of war to London. So yeah,
And
you're
so
correct.
this actually models the way, in fact, early biographies, the earliest biographies of male scientists were written, what they call the great men history of science. So you would have a Louis Pasteur or a Albert Einstein, so we, are we just merely talking about, these women also from
That
the
very
greatness,
perspective,
where
yeah.
you aspects several aspects of their personality and show them as exceptions rather than as a norm. So it was to actually to counter all of these, that nearly for 30 or 40 years after Amal, after Annamani, that you had the Indian Academy of Sciences. They actually commissioned a report, on the participation of women in in sciences. they there are now, of course, several women who are now scientists spanning across the range of fields. Now there is now entire policies to actually ensure that women don't drop out, from pursuing careers in science. There was also, I mean, there was serious debates as to why exactly did women drop out, also as to why is that women in America came into the first place in the science. It was because with the growth of an industrialized workforce, you actually needed more and more people to participate in industry. So it was which is why women started being encouraged in the first place, and industrialization of society. So how does this work in the in the Indian context? So overall, there have been several. It is from these women that now we have a rich set of sociological studies itself, looking at how do we improve women's participation in science. I mean, all governments everywhere are constantly talking about, ensuring that women don't drop out, because India also has aspirations to be superpower, etc. And so you absolutely need greater participation by women. So the tide has actually turned from people asking why women to we absolutely need women.
I don't think tide has turned. I think it has just
The eternal pessimist, Shobna,
no,
things are going ahead.
no. Things are going ahead, but not fast enough. If yeah, if it was for me, I don't think we are running with full steam ahead, and we need to, because right. It's also about how we sort of in the society perceives women, because there are, in fact, yesterday itself I was listening to a show where there was a study by UK, by a company in UK on maths, on how men, comparing the women, the male and female students, and in maths, performance in maths, and they found that female weren't doing well enough. But if you were to go greater into depth, it's because right in the childhood they're told that women are not so good with maths. It's men who are naturally inclined towards math. So all that has to change, I think.
But
It's
there is also complex. It's part of what is called the socialization theory, and it is also said that women who actually perform well in mathematical tests over time, they tend to underrepresent themselves because they socialization forces them, even at an unconscious level, to fit into certain boxes. So doing well in the math test means that you're actually moving out of those boxes and you want to come
come
back
back.
into an acceptable position, so you suppress your innate
Exactly.
ability.
So you yourself are proving yourself wrong.
I never disputed you,
Yes,
Shobana.
you are. So what I'm saying is we still have a long way to go. And what we brought to you today were three trailblazers, three role models, that and three pioneers who broke every barrier that came their way. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we would love if you could share your views on the subject, and if you could actually share your own stories. We would actually love women scientists to reach out to us, women professionals to reach out to us, and do write to us. And do share, subscribe, and talk about our podcast to everyone. That's all for now. It's goodbye from me, Shobna.
And goodbye from me, Jacob.